Hi, my friends. Welcome to Deep Six, the Deep State, my daily commentary on the news that's evolving. We've been doing very, very well. We've had over 100,000 people watching each of these, which is quite a tribute. You know, I think of a baseball stadium like Yankee Stadium completely filled. That's 50,000. So two of them, that's pretty impressive. That's really a humbling experience. Thank you for watching. And thank you also for sharing, because that's what makes it possible for people to know that I'm on and to begin to listen to it. And I appreciate it. Today we're going to talk about the tax cut. We're going to talk about Hillary fudging about the Dossier funding. And we'll talk a bit about the opioid addiction panel recommendations and some other good stuff. Hillary, once again, I can slide this one by him. They won't notice. I'm going to put my spin on it, and hey, you know, I get away with it all the time. She was asked finally about funding the Dossier, and she said, "I think most serious people understand that this was research started by a Republican donor during the Republican primary. And when Trump got the nomination for the Republican Party, the people doing it came to my campaign lawyer." That is incredible. That's like saying Barack Obama was just continuing the George Trump presidency. The fact is that a Republican donor, I think it was Paul Singer, the founder, editor, owner, or whatever of the Washington Free Beacon, set this up as a method of gathering information about the various Republican candidates. It's not clear whether he was trying to develop dirt on any one of them, like Trump, or was it just a research mission? But in any case, it had nothing to do with Russia, nothing to do with any collusion. It had nothing to do with any of the stuff that ultimately came out in the Fusion dossier. What happened was that when Trump won the nomination, he stopped his efforts because he was a Republican supporting Trump. And at that point, Fusion went to Hillary's campaign and said, "Do you want to fund this?" And they said, "Oh, absolutely, we do." And they allocated over $1 million to Fusion. They paid $165,000 to Christopher Steele, the MI6 spy, to go ahead and do this. But to characterize this as an extension of what the Republicans were doing is nuts. Under the Republicans, Fusion had no interest in Russia or in any of the allegations that flowed. This was entirely Hillary using this firm to conduct negative research by making up and framing Donald Trump for something he didn't do, something there's no evidence of, and something that is still totally unproven. Not just unproven, it's unsubstantiated. There's no evidence at all about it. So that's how this all came to be. But Hillary, once again, I can fudge on this one. Now, the news media are filled with talking about how Donald Trump's ratings are at an all-time historic low, not just for him, but for almost any president. Garbage. Totally wrong. As I've explained, there are 6 polls that are monitoring Trump's approval on a daily tracking basis. 5 of them survey as their sample either adults in the United States or registered voters in the United States. Only one of them surveys likely voters, and that one is Rasmussen, and that has Trump at 44% approval, basically where it's been, and pretty close to his vote share. The other surveys survey a lot of non-voters. Gallup does adults, and that, for example, includes many, many people that are not registered. They have 760 adults in their sample, as I recall, and probably 100 or 150 of them aren't citizens, aren't registered. Another probably 250 of them don't vote. And so you're probably down to a sample of 300 people kicking around in a haystack of 750. And the people that are loading up this survey who don't vote tend to be Democrats. They tend to be uneducated, poor, and Democratic. So that when you narrow the field down to the people who actually do vote, you get a much different result. You get Trump with an approval rating of 44%. What's the problem?
I've been asked to raise the camera up just a hair.
Okay.
So bear with me, guys. Thanks, Jack Tapper.
I just got levitated.
Okay.
It's Jack Tapper, right?
Jack Tapper, and then there's Jack Pearson is the little guy.
But Jack Tapper,
he's the old man.
I was watching the other day Jake Tapper, or reading something that he wrote, and I said, "My God, that's the same guy as in my webcast," but it's not. So his job approval is really 44, which is fine. In fact, that's pretty good. It at one time was at 40 or 39 in Rasmussen. Now it's at 44, and that's pretty good. But the media has invented this complete fiction, and they keep quoting one another that this is an all-time historic low, and it's not. It's right about average, and it's right where most presidents are, and it's pretty good given Trump's ratings. Pretty good for him. Now, when Trump discovered that this terrorist, we always have to learn the name, Sayfullo Saipov, who killed 8 people in Lower Manhattan 2 days over the weekend, when he learned that he came to the United States from Uzbekistan as part of the Visa Diversity Lottery, he terminated the program completely. And that is wonderful. That's exactly the kind of aggressive, bold action that we need to take. The program itself was the most poorly conceived program you can imagine. The sole criterion for getting chosen was luck in your name being pulled at the lottery. And to enter the lottery, to be in the basket that was sorted through, you had to come from a country whose sole qualification was fewer than 50,000 other immigrants to the United States. So the idea was that if Swahililand was only sending 1,000 people to the United States, we obviously want more people from Swahililand, so we put their names in the lottery and we choose them, and 50,000 people from all these countries combined get to send people to the United States with no verification, no real screening. And this monster came here and perpetrated this horror. And by the way, it turns out that he has sponsored the immigration of 23 other people, mini monsters. Some of them are his children or his family, but many of them are probably his co-conspirators in ISIS. Once you let one of these folks in, they become a magnet for everybody else coming in. And it's not the kind of magnet we want in our country. It's the exact opposite of what we want. Now, a lot of people have been asking me about, one other point. He came in 2000, 6 years. He came in 2011. He'd been here for 6 years. Now, we didn't know about terrorism back then. We didn't know that immigrants from Muslim countries are likely to promulgate terrorism. No way. Who would have imagined that? So you can lay his admission to the United States right at Obama's doorstep and at the doorstep of Senator Chuck Schumer from New York, the state whose residents were just murdered, because it was his bill to set up this stupid diversity program. Now, a lot of people have been asking me what I think the fate of the tax cut is going to be that the Republicans just proposed. I think it's going to pass. And I think it'll pass in a very good form, although there might be some changes made to get it passed. Let me just summarize what it says. It takes the existing 7 tax bracket and collapses them into 4. It leaves the top bracket at 39.6%, so the Democrats can't characterize this as a tax cut for the rich. But it does say that the bracket of 35%, the one right below it, applies to income up to $1 million. So if you make more than $1 million, you get into 39.6 for the income over $1 million. But if you make between $500,000 and $1 million, you pay 35. So for them, it's a significant tax cut. It also separates people who are paying the top rate because they are making a lot of money personally as salary or as income, or their whole corporate entity is making that much money, and they're a pass-through corporation, like a subchapter S or an LLC. What that means is that you set up a mom-and-pop store, and you don't want to call it mom-and-pop incorporated and get a corporate license and pay corporate taxes on it. It's not that important. It's not that big. So you operate as mom-and-pop. and then on tax day you file a joint return for mom and pop, and your income comes to, let's say, $400,000, your gross income, and that's not net of any deductions or anything like that. That's your store income. At that point, you pay 39.6% of that in taxes. Well, what Trump is saying is that because you are really not a corporation, you're a very small partnership, and because 75% of the jobs created in America are from exactly those type of firms, we're going to create a job creator preference, a tax break for you. And instead of paying 39.6, you're going to pay 25. And that will free up massive resources for job creation. I know of many consultants personally, many people personally, who will be able to hire extra people because of that job creation tax credit. It's absolutely brilliant. It says you can't treat mom and pop the same way you treat General Motors. And if somebody earns a very high income from General Motors, you want to tax him more than someone who is an entrepreneur on his own who has a high gross income, which includes the various expenses of his business. And you want to do that because you want him to create jobs and you want him to really go out there and create jobs. And as for General Motors, you're lowering their corporate tax rate from 35% down to 20%. And that takes care of their job creation very nicely. So by cutting corporate taxes and by the pass-through for small businesses, it's a very, very good tax cut for the economy. And because of the provisions aimed at the working class, the lower middle class, it's a very good thing. First of all, it means most of them will not have to pay any income tax at all, because it doubles the standard deduction for a family from $12,500 to $25,000. Secondly, it increases the tax credit for each child from $1,000 to $1,600. And given the fact that 3/4 of all taxpayers do not itemize their returns, this means a big tax cut for every single one of them. The only ones of those that won't benefit enormously are the people who already pay no income tax. And many, many people who now itemize returns are going to stop it because the individual tax deduction is so large, combined with the child care tax credit. It repeals the alternative minimum tax that had become almost a replacement for the current tax code because of inflation. It creates a new $300 tax credit, that's right off your taxes, for care for a parent or for a dependent non-child. So it really can help relieve the burden on families that are trying to care for elderly relatives at home. It does not in any way affect 401ks, and it makes state and local taxes non-deductible on the income tax, except the property tax will continue to be deductible up to a total of $10,000. And if you figure that the average tax rate in the United States of full valuation is probably about 5 or 6%, that means that you're effectively exempting property that's under $300,000 in income, in value. So you're dealing here again only with fairly wealthy taxpayers. This is the old Obama trick. You raise taxes, but you do it only on the rich, and therefore nobody else minds it, and it passes. And it's okay now because it's to pay for a tax cut, but still it's a good political move for them to make. Mortgage interest deduction will continue. However, it will not be available for any home, for any newly purchased home, for that costs more than $500,000. Now it's $1 million. And old home, previously purchased homes, it'll be available regardless up to $10,000 for property tax. Now, the reason I think this is going to pass is that numbers are fungible. You couldn't pass Obamacare repeal because it involved words. There's things like pre-existing conditions or required services or community rating, policies that either could exist or not exist and they made a huge difference in health care. This bill really doesn't involve any policies. It's just numbers. And there's a lot of room for maneuver in it for Trump. I mean, let's say everybody raises hell and you can't eliminate the deduction for state income taxes, okay? Let's say everybody goes completely crazy on that. Well, Trump could easily cut the corporate tax rate not from 35 to 20, but from 35 to 25. And he could easily cut the, he could just adjust each of the numbers to make the tax cut a little less generous to get revenue to deal with deductibility of the income tax. And what he can do also is he can do the same thing with income taxes he did with property taxes and leave the deduction up to a certain level of income. You could say that anybody who makes less than $150,000 as a couple can deduct their income tax payments, but above that they can't. Again, reducing the number of people who are affected. It generally doesn't change your revenue because most of your money there comes from rich people paying a lot of taxes. So there's a lot of wiggle room there. And I hope that Trump and Ryan and McConnell and the various Republicans realize that the way to get this taxed is to negotiate those figures. Not absolutes, just negotiate them, make them work back and forth. You have room here in the tax cut. And if they do that, I think this is going to pass. And I think its effect will be enormous. I think it's going to kindle incredible economic growth. I think it's going to completely remake the income stagnation that grips America. I mean, that's how significant it is. For lower middle income people, that is, people who are making, let's say, $30,000 a year household income up to about $80,000 a year, it's going to be an enormous savings. And the job opportunities for folks will increase dramatically. And I think it will reverse the last 2 decades of income stagnation in the United States and will literally make us great again. This tax cut is so fantastic and so excellent that its impact can't possibly be overstated. And good for Trump for having the guts to really go the whole hog and not just do a token little tax cut like Bush or Reagan did. And good for him for concentrating the tax cut at the middle income Americans. Had he just simply cut the top rate from 40% to 35%, like Bush did, okay, that's nice. That was effective. That generated a lot of growth. But instead, to carve out a new category of job creators and cut their taxes. By the way, of the 13 million people who pay the top bracket, 11 million would be classified as job creators under this and would get a tax break. That's very significant. And to double the deductions, almost double the per child deduction, these are very important steps aimed at the middle class. This will help a retired or former steel worker in Ohio unbelievably. Night and day difference.
Dick, Michelle Pokipala, our good friend, asks, will Trump also end the refugee program?
No, you can't end it. You don't want to end it. But he has cut the number of refugees from 100,000 a year to 50,000. And he has announced that we will be very careful in screening those refugees.
And we have some questions, but I know they're on the agenda, so I'm going to hold off. But,
okay, you could.
I have another. Well, I have other ones I saved up, if you don't mind.
Go.
This is a good one from Brandon Altos. He wants to know, what influence did Roy Cohn have on Trump?
Are you serious?
Yeah.
What's his name?
Brandon Altos.
Brandon, do you know of my relationship with Roy Cohn?
Oh, that's right. Aren't you related?
Yeah. Tweet a comment on that. Roy is my first cousin once removed.
I forgot.
And I knew him very well as I was growing up. Roy, for those who aren't on the inside, was the chief counsel of the McCarthy Committee that investigated communists in the early 1950s. And he achieved a great deal of fame for that, in many circles notoriety. And he went after a lot of communists, a lot of movie directors, a lot of people all over the place. And after the McCarthy Committee was ended in censure by the Senate because it went way too far in going after basically innocent people, Roy became an attorney who was one of the top attorneys in the world. He represented Aristotle Onassis and all kinds of really important, high-profile people, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor and others. And Roy represented Donald Trump, Fred Trump, Donald's father, and Donald himself. And Roy farmed out most of the legal work for Trump to my father, Eugene Morris, from the law firm of Demov and Morris, D-E-M-O-V, and Morris. And my father did all the legal work for Trump Tower, and Trump has been very, very generous in praising him as the best lawyer he ever had. And that was great. And Roy was a really tough political pro. Bobby Kennedy hated him because he beat him out for the job of chief counsel of the McCarthy Committee. Bobby was the minority counsel, the Democratic counsel. And Bobby never forgave Roy for that. And at Bobby's direction, Morgenthau, the U.S. attorney for New York, indicted Roy on a series of charges, and Roy won acquittal as his own lawyer. And then a second time, Morgenthau indicted him. And a second time, Roy got acquitted. And then he wasn't content with that. He went after him a third time on other charges. And Roy was acquitted. He beat all three charges with himself as the attorney. That's how good a lawyer he was, and really aggressive. And he taught Trump to play hardball. He taught Trump attack back when you get hit him back, go after him. Don't let stuff pass under the bridge. And there's a great story about Roy. There's a great restaurant in Manhattan called 21, and Roy would always like to have lunch there. And I had lunch with him several times there. And they would always seat him at a table right by the kitchen, which was kind of a put-down because the Manhattan establishment liberals hated Roy. So they'd put him down, give him the worst table in the house. So Roy never complained, and one day he called up for a reservation for 3 in the name of Mr. Cohn. He arrived early, and they showed him to his table. And Roy said, fine. And then the Duke and Duchess of Windsor came in to have lunch with their attorney, Roy Cohn. And they looked at the table they gave him right by the kitchen. And this was the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. So they went over to Roy. They said, oh, your guests have just come. Let us bring you to a more suitable table. And I said, no. This is the table you always give me, and talk just like this. This is the table I'm going to eat at. And they had to hold the doors in the kitchen, and everybody had to stack the plates quietly. And from then on, Roy got really good tables at 21. Roy was also gay, although he hid that fact. He denied it to his death. And he died of AIDS, and he kept saying, no, I have liver cancer. And there's a great movie and play, Angels in America, which is about that, and about Roy is one of the leading anti-gay crusaders in the country, was secretly gay, and lived with men for his entire life. That was interesting. There's a great scene from that movie. At the end of the movie, Roy is always trying to fix judicial cases because he knew all the judges. And whenever something would come up, he would say, who's the judge? And in the movie, Roy is dying, and he's about to go to before the God, and he said, who's the judge? It's a great take. Sorry for all the digression.
No, that's okay. That's what makes it fun. Mitchell Fiedler wanted to know, CBS is saying the lottery pool for immigration was created by Bush. What is the truth?
No, it was, well, Bush signed the bill. No. It passed in 1995, and that was under the Clinton administration. Yeah, Bush didn't repeal it, but certainly didn't create it.
And Joanne Jackson Carter, she's new, she's very worried. She says, can they really impeach Donald Trump?
I think the chances of that happening are increasingly remote because it's clear that Mueller doesn't have anything to stand on. It's clear that he doesn't have any evidence, and he's trying to squeeze oranges that I think are pretty well dry. But he hasn't stopped yet. He has a massive staff, a massive budget, unbelievable power, can subpoena anybody and indict anybody and threaten anybody. And, you know, he's got a huge staff, and I think we just have to give this a little more time. But at the moment, Trump's odds of surviving are pretty good.
And Lori Fedorek wants to know, do you have to pay a fine if you don't have health insurance?
Yes, you do. Legally, you do. It's in the bill, it's in the law, and we haven't repealed it. And there is no effort to repeal it in the current new tax law. There should be, but there's not. However, you don't really. The IRS insists that you provide your tax information on your 1040 form. But if you don't, they have indicated that they are not going to pursue people with fines, as they have in the past. Under Obama, every year, $3 billion of fines were paid by a total of 6 million people, an average of $500 each. It's my understanding that Trump is not going to enforce that. So I think the practical answer is no. Now, there's a new... First of all, let me say that this video is sponsored, as the others are, by the Patriot Gold Group. And if you look at the tax cut, and you look at what's likely to happen from it, the explosion of economic growth, once the economy is doing well, money is going to come out of hiding. Obama quadrupled the money supply in the U.S. from $800 million to $3 trillion. And that money is either on corporate books where the company's not spending it, or banks where the bank isn't lending it, or households have paid down their credit card accounts, but they're too insecure about the economy to spend money. And one of the reasons we're getting good growth now is people are more secure under Trump, and that money's coming out of hiding. But if too much of it comes out, and too many of us spend too much of it too quickly, that can cause inflation. Too much money being spent and not enough goods being produced. And that's why the Fed is probably going to raise interest rates again. And once that happens with inflation, your only protection is gold and silver. So gold never loses its value, whereas the dollar loses its value all the time. In the last 20 years, the dollar has lost 40% of its value. So if you held gold instead of the dollar, you would be 40% ahead of the game right now. So call the Patriot Gold Group at the phone number Renee is posting, or go to patriotgoldgroup.com.
Guess what? We're #1 in the world.
Oh, we have more viewers now than anybody else in the world. Yay.
At this moment, yes.
Good. Now, the FBI interviewed the terrorist, Saipov, I think is his name. What's the bastard's name?
Not even worth mentioning.
Yeah, Saipov. They interviewed him in 2015 because they discovered links to terrorism, and they didn't see anything worth pursuing. The FBI should be held accountable for that. It's not enough that we learn that now. There should be an investigation, and there should be consequences for agents and for careers. You know, right now the way it works is if they unfairly target a Muslim, they can be called on account for racial profiling and endanger their careers. But if they go after a guy who might be a terrorist and leave it go and turns out he is a terrorist, there are no repercussions. So I think it's very important that we learn what interview happened, when it happened, and why there was no follow-up on him. And obviously these agents are fallible, and obviously things can change over 2 years. But somebody has to be accountable for this. Not a scapegoat, but a procedure, a bureau, a generic lack of follow-up. This needs to be investigated. And I hope the Homeland Security committees of the Congress do that. Now, there's something very interesting that we learned a few days ago. You've read all, of course, Russia's attempts to meddle and influence the U.S. election. And you've probably seen, I showed in yesterday's video, some of the stupid, clumsy attempts to influence the American people. One showed Jesus Christ in white robes with the devil suitably dressed, doing hand wrestling. And it said, Clinton wants Satan to win, and Trump wants Jesus to win. And that's supposed to influence voters. Another had a big thing of Texans, and it said, Texas should secede from the Union. All of this stuff echoing right-wing propaganda and views, but so ham-handed, so clumsy, that it obviously would have no effect. Now it turns out that right after Election Day, Russian operatives posing as Americans, a group called Black Matters U.S., which has been found to be a Russian-based company, placed internet ads promoting an anti-Trump march in New York City right after the election. A Facebook page on November 12, 16, shows the event's host as BM, a known alias of Black Matters U.S., used throughout the group's promotional materials, which is a Russian front. And it asked people to come to Union Square in Manhattan, 14th Street, at noon to march from there to Trump Tower, or march all the way up Wall Street, all the way up Fifth Avenue. And 16,000 people showed up because of that advertisement. And it was one of the demonstrations you read about after Trump's election by Hillary partisans who were protesting the election. And this was called and sponsored by the Russians. And this casts the whole effort, for me at least, the charge of meddling, into a totally different perspective. From the time I was a kid, I used to follow Soviet propaganda closely. I used to subscribe to the magazines, and probably on a million lists, and used to read it and understand what they were saying. And they were always promoting divisions within the United States. Their big thing was segregation in the South. And they were promoting civil rights and black freedom marches and all that good stuff. But they were using it to try to discredit the United States. And then they would talk about crime, they'd talk about organized crime. They'd do everything they could to sow division, distrust, and animosity within the United States, dividing the American people from one another. And this apparently was more of the same. It wasn't a targeted strategic effort to elect Donald Trump president. They went after him just like they went after Hillary. And this march is proof of that. And that puts it in a very different context, that this was just the normal stuff the Soviets used to do to try to make our lives miserable and to try to undermine our democracy. It's not nice, but it's not illegal, and it certainly isn't treason. And it certainly is not grounds for impeaching a president.
Dick, Jerry Houston wants to know, do you think it's a crime for Obama, Hillary, and her imps to sell part of Wyoming to the Russians?
Yeah, what you're referring to there is the sale of our uranium mines to the Russians, many of which are located in Wyoming. And they involved the transfer of a lot of land adjacent to those mines to the Russians. And the answer is no, it's not illegal, because we decided as a country to regulate it and not to let it just happen. We set up a cabinet committee called the Committee on Foreign Investments in the United States. And its job was to review any foreign purchase of a U.S. company or of U.S. land or of U.S. assets, precisely to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. And the head of that committee is the Secretary of State, and Hillary Clinton was the head of it. And that's the committee that approved the uranium sale. That's what we're hollering about. And by the way, the chief of staff to that committee, I reported 2 days ago, was a Islamic militant, the former president of the Young Muslims of the World, of North America, I think, and an activist in the Muslim community, appointed by President Obama to be the chief of staff to that commission. And the commission did a terrible job of guarding our interests, particularly when there were payoffs involved. Now, that Uranium One company that purchased those mines, Uranium One existed as a major Canadian outfit. Russia purchased a majority of Uranium One, and then Uranium One, with the Russians in charge, tried to buy and succeeded in buying the uranium mines. Now, at the time, they pledged that they would not export any of this uranium outside the United States. And that's important, because we need to import about a third of the uranium that we use. We're not self-sufficient in uranium. We could be. We've got enough of deposits of it, but we just aren't at this point. Hopefully that'll change. And they said they would never export it. Well, the Hill newspaper magazine, which has really helped break this Uranium One story, you should read it every day. I used to write for it for 15 years, thehill.com, has revealed that 25% of the uranium mined from 2012 to 2014 was in fact sold outside the United States. And that is a direct violation of the circumstances under which the sale was approved. And hopefully that will lead to a re-examination of the sale.
We have a lot of questions rolling in, but I wanted to give a shout out to Wendell Latrull. He is watching you from Mindanao Island in the Philippines right this moment.
Good to see you.
Want to be there now. And Cathy Schulze Chapman wants to know, how can we possibly drain the FBI and rid it of all the political bias and corruption?
Well, we have a new FBI commissioner, Christopher Wray, W-R-A-Y. We have a new Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, and the draining has got to start. I think that the current controversy about Uranium One will lead to the appointment of a special prosecutor. And I think he is going to go after the FBI aggressively. And I think that will promote the kind of house cleaning that you're talking about.
And Elizabeth Nassel wants to know, who oversees the FBI? Did you just mention?
Department of Justice.
Okay. And
now, there was a really interesting story that came into the media and the news today. Donna Brazile, who's a good friend of mine, who was the campaign manager for Al Gore in 2000 and worked closely with me in the Clinton campaign in the 1990s, in the dark era in my life. And
you've seen the light.
And Donna was a strong supporter of Bernie Sanders. She's a way over liberal. She doesn't much like Hillary anyway. We had that in common. And Donna says that in a book that she's just written, that, and I forget the name of the book, I should say that, I'm sorry, but in the book she writes about the deliberate effort to fix the Democratic primary so Hillary would win, and to take the entire apparatus of the Democratic National Committee and put it at Hillary's disposal before she was the nominee, during the primaries, when it was legally required to stay neutral. Once Hillary won the nomination, it's fine for her to run the committee. But before that, especially when there's a hotly contested primary, which could have gone either way, the Democratic committee has to be neutral. And I believe it was that violation of neutrality that led to the hacking of their emails, or I believe the leaking of their emails during the Democratic convention, rather than something that was done by the Russians. Brazile reports that there was an agreement signed early in the primary process by Amy Dacey, the former CEO of the Democratic National Committee, and Robbie Mook, M-O-O-K, who was the counsel for the Hillary campaign, and a copy went to our friend Mark Elias, the lawyer at Perkins Coie, who commissioned the funding of the Dossier through Fusion. And it specified that in exchange for raising money and giving it to the Democratic National Committee, Hillary would control the party's finances, strategy, and all the money raised. Her campaign got the right of refusal of who would be the party communications director, and it would make final decisions on all other staffing. The Democratic Committee also was required to consult with the campaign about budgeting, data, analytics, and mailings. In other words, it basically turned the committee over to Hillary and said, this is your show now. Now, it is true that Obama spent the Democratic Party into the ground, just like he did the country. The Democratic Party at the start of the 96 election was in debt for at least $15 million, and perhaps as much as 25. And the party was very bad at raising money, and Hillary and her campaign did most of the fundraising. So they provided the party with most of its money. And in return for that, she called the tune on what would happen in the party. One of the reasons she had that power is that Debbie Wasserman Schultz did not raise much money, not because she was lazy or couldn't, but because she wanted it to be Hillary's money. She let Hillary use the party apparatus to raise money. You see, when somebody contributes to a political campaign, they are limited in that contribution to $1,600 a person. $3,200 for a couple. But in contributions to the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, you're limited to only, I think, $200,000 or $300,000, and in certain cases, not limited at all. So, and that money that's raised for the Democratic Party has to be divided among 32 state parties in Democratic states, and they each get 1/32 of it, and that's how it aggregates into so large a sum. But what Hillary would do is pull a fast one, as always. She would make the state parties sign the money over to the Democratic Party, the National Committee, and then under this agreement take control of the finances of the Democratic Committee. So when Hillary went to one of these high bracket fundraisers, she wasn't just hitting people up for $3,200 each. She was hitting couples up for more like $500,000 each. And that's how she was able to raise several $billion and channel it through the Democratic Party by making the party her puppet. And the Bernie Sanders people are right to be strongly opposed to what Hillary's doing. Now, Hillary has moved aggressively since then to try to consolidate her power, her people's power, over the various state parties in the United States. And Sanders has battled them state by state. And that civil war in the Democratic Party is getting increasingly nasty. We'll be following it more.
Dick, we have a question from William Mardon. Does the slush fund that Hillary set up show the intent to undermine the United States laws regarding transparency?
Oh, yeah, sure it does. Absolutely. The law requires you to itemize every expenditure. And when you take at least $8 million, maybe $11 million, and you say attorney's fees, and it was not attorney's fees, it was money the attorney got to spend however he wanted, so you didn't have to itemize the results, damn right that contravenes the intent. And it is a violation of election law, and it should be prosecuted. The problem with that is that the penalties are relatively small, usually financial. And the big problem is that the Federal Elections Commission consists of 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans. So each party effectively blocks it from pursuing its own corruption. And doubtless the Democratic officials would block that as well.
And Roger Richter wants to know, do you think Rudy Giuliani would accept the position of a special counsel if it's offered to him?
That's a good possibility. I think there's a real chance that he might. I think the reason he didn't want to be Attorney General is he did not want to go through Senate confirmation, and who would? The kind of nastiness they bring up. But special counsel does not have to be confirmed, and he might well want to do that.
Rick K. wanted to know, why can't government employees go on Affordable Care Act insurance?
Well, members of Congress are not. Government employees, because their health insurance is through the federal government rather than through Obamacare. You know, I'm not really an expert on the differences there between their policies and the policies of Obamacare, but I'll have a look at it and check it out. Can you remind me to comment on that?
Yes, I will. Yes.
Now, Chris Christie, governor of New Jersey, headed a commission Trump appointed to investigate opioid abuse and made some very interesting recommendations that I think are pretty good. The coverage of it, as always in the media, was simplistic and dealt only with the amount of money that would be spent on opioid addiction. But a lot of these changes recommended by this panel are very important and don't particularly relate to money. The first is that there be created a federal database of prescriptions that basically exists under Obamacare anyway, so that you can eliminate doctor shopping for opioid addiction, of people who go doctor to doctor to doctor getting new prescriptions without telling them they already have 5 others. Secondly, apparently the Medicare and Medicaid, mainly Medicaid, requirements and regulations work hard at trying to make sure that doctors and pharmacies prescribe the cheapest pain medications possible, and those are usually opioids. So this commission recommends that they be released from that obligation and be permitted to choose more expensive pain medication if it's non-opioid, which God knows is a very needed change. Much of the opioid addiction comes from people who needed the painkillers after surgery or in some serious illness, and then don't and continue to take the painkillers because they're addicted. It would also encourage Medicaid and insurance companies to cover non-opioid pain medication to encourage people to use it. There's also a drug called Indivior, Indivior, that is an alternative medication for pain that it promoted heavily in its report. And finally, it would allow a broader range of medical personnel like nurses or emergency specialists or immediate care people to administer injections of naloxone, which is the medication that can reverse opioid overdose and save lives in incredible situations where people you swear are dead get injected and come back to life. And it's important that anybody be allowed to give those shots so that people don't die because there's no one to give the injection or there are no injections on the ambulance. Very good changes. By the way, global temperatures have dropped. Down. There was a spike in global temperatures last year and earlier this year because of the El Nino effect, that is the Pacific tides and currents that affect the West Coast and the rest of our weather. That created more warming. Now that has ended and it has cooled back down to the pre-El Nino level. So that's interesting for those who freak out about climate change.
Well, Dick, Michelle Grivart asks, can the people who donated to the DNC sue for misusing funds?
No.
And she also wants to know, do you think Sessions is part of the swamp?
Well, he's got his toe in it. The question is whether he begins to go after people. There was one enormously positive sign, which is that Sessions has permitted congressional investigators to get their hands on the FBI covert agent who infiltrated the Uranium One deal and Russia's efforts to bribe people in the U.S. to secure access to our uranium. That could be the first step leading to a special prosecutor to do that. The jury's still out on that. We can't be sure yet. We just don't know.
And Jim Dunham asks, are any Democrats going to support the tax plan?
That's hard to tell. It's possible that some Democrats will support it after it's passed. In other words, they'll sit there waiting to see if we get 50 votes, enough to pass it. And if we do, they'll vote for it just so they can say that they did and help them run for re-election doing that. But will there be any real Democratic support for the tax cut to help it pass? No. The way the Democrats are playing stuff in Congress now is they are not saying the way the minority party used to do. This is our position, this is our point of view, and if you're a Democrat and you disagree with that, you can break with the party and vote your own way, but you're violating what the party wants you to do. Now what the Democrats are doing is saying we are going to vote as a unit. We're going to block vote 48-0. And don't you dare stray from that. If you stray from it, you lose your committee assignments, your seniority, all kinds of stuff that's important to you, and we'll all ostracize you and hate you socially, which is a very big deal there, like in the House, in the Senate gym and stuff. And that's a very effective cudgel. And what that means is that basically, if you're going to get one Democrat, you're going to get 48 of them. They're going to vote as a bloc. And if you need to negotiate to try to get one Democrat, you got to satisfy the other 47 as well with the changes you're going to offer in your legislation. That's an almost impossible task. So no, the era of bipartisan passage of legislation, which I worked hard at in the Clinton administration when I got welfare reform passed, where the Republicans split 50-50 on it, and the Democrats worked with us to pass it. Those days are quite over.
Dick, Dean Saylor wants to know, how come we're not hearing anything more about the Vegas killings?
Well, there was just a big piece on that in, I think, the Daily Caller or one of the blogs, and it was a very interesting one. And I don't know. I mean, that's a question really worth asking. I don't know the answer to that, and there's a lot we do need to learn. Well, I'm sorry.
Well, we have our selfie of the day, but if you could just entertain me for a minute. I just wanted to read a couple of comments that people have written in on.
Sure.
First of all, Kimberly Phillips Smith is on right now live, and she just says, Mr. Morris, great show. You say more in just a few minutes than others do in 3 hours.
Thank you.
And Raphael Murata took the time to write to you personally and wrote, Mr. Morris, you are my hero. I appreciate your effort in opening my eyes to what is really going behind the scenes of political system today, and especially bringing the truth to light. Your views and your friendly, outspoken word empowers me to be an informed American. Thank you. So
that's what I really love. I feel that Americans just don't get enough information, and they certainly don't get it unbiased. So that's what I try to do, and I love that you're helping me doing it by watching. Now, the selfie of the day, the person who is photographed holding up my book, Rogue Spooks,
is actually it's not a person.
Oh, it's a dog. Oh, Glenn Rogers' dog, Miss Daisy. She's a Boston Terrier.
Yes.
A Boston Terrier holding up my book. Hey, Boston went Democrat.
There she is. I don't know if they're going to see it on there, but I'm going to post it.
And there is Glenn Rogers' dog.
Yeah, I'm going to post it on the comments. So yeah,
that's cool.
Miss Daisy.
But we lost to Boston. Thanks very much. I'll see you tomorrow.